April 8, 1943. 27,000 feet above occupied France. The oxygen mask could not hide Oberleutnant Ralph Hermichen's smirk. From the cockpit of his Focke-Wulf FW-190A5, the sky was impossibly clear, one of those crystalline spring mornings when the world below looked harmless and distant. Hermichen, 26 years old and already a veteran ace of Jag-Schwader 26, watched with amusement as dark, ungainly silhouettes struggled upward toward his formation. American fighters. "They've sent us flying milk bottles," Hermichen transmitted to his wingman, laughter unmistakable in his voice. Below them, 16 Republic P-47C Thunderbolts of the 4th Fighter Group clawed their way skyward in tight formation. Each aircraft weighed nearly 7 tons when loaded, powered by a massive 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R 2800 double Wasp engine. At altitude, the strain was visible. To German pilots accustomed to sleek Spitfires, agile Yak fighters, and razor-edge Messerschmitt Bf-109s, the American machines looked absurd. They were barrel-shaped monsters with greenhouse canopies, wings that seemed far too small, propellers larger than anything in the Luftwaffe inventory. They did not look like fighters. They looked like mistakes. What Hermichen did not know, what no German pilot circling above could imagine, was that they were witnessing the arrival of the aircraft that would methodically annihilate the Luftwaffe's fighter arm. Within 18 months, these so-called flying milk bottles would transform from objects of ridicule into instruments of terror. Their 8.50 caliber Browning machine guns would become the most feared sound in German skies. The mathematics of destruction were already loaded into their wings. 3,400 rounds of ammunition, a combined 6,000 rounds per minute, enough concentrated firepower to tear a fighter apart in under 2 seconds. But on that April morning, none of that was yet known. The Thunderbolt pilots were combat novices. The Germans were masters. Major Donald Blakesley, commanding the 335th Fighter Squadron, spotted the German formation first. A former Eagle Squadron veteran who had flown Spitfires with the RAF only weeks earlier, Blakesley understood some of his men did not. Survival in the P-47 required abandoning everything pilots thought they knew about air combat. The Thunderbolt was not a dogfighter in the traditional sense. It was not designed to turn tightly or climb rapidly at low altitude. Where German engineers had pursued lightweight interceptors optimized for agility, Republic Aviation had created something entirely different, a high-altitude juggernaut that used mass, power, armor, and firepower to rewrite the rules of aerial warfare. Among the 56 American pilots scattered across the French sky, that morning were men who would become legends, future aces whose names would one day strike fear into Luftwaffe hearts. But on April 8, 1943, they were rookies in an untested aircraft, facing the most experienced fighter force on Earth. The Germans had been fighting continuously since 1939. Poland, France, Britain, Russia. The Americans had been in combat for exactly 0 days. This was the beginning. The P-47 Thunderbolt was born out of panic. In June 1940, as German fighters swept across France and Britain stood alone, the U.S. Army Air Forces issued urgent new requirements. They wanted a high-altitude interceptor capable of meeting the Luftwaffe's best on equal terms. Alexander Kartveli, Republic Aviation's Georgian-born chief designer, responded, not with elegance, but with brute force. "It will be a dinosaur," Kartveli told his team, "but it will be a dinosaur with good proportions." The result was the XP-47B, a prototype that shocked everyone who saw it. At nearly 10,000 pounds empty, it outweighed its predecessor by more than 60%. Its massive turbo-supercharger system, fed by exhaust gases and buried deep within the rear fuselage, gave the aircraft a swollen, almost pregnant appearance. Test pilots approaching it for the first time asked the same question. "This thing actually flies?" It did, and at altitude, it flew like nothing else in the world. The R-2800 engine could maintain full power at 27,000 feet, where German fighters gasped for air. The turbo-supercharger delivered sea-level performance in the stratosphere, where conventional superchargers failed. But power came at a cost. When Hubert Hub Zemke, commanding officer of the 56th Fighter Group, began training on the P-47 at Bridgeport, Connecticut, He despised it. Between September 1942 and January 1943, his unit lost 18 pilots and 41 aircraft, all in training accidents. The Thunderbolt killed more Americans in training than Germans would in its first months of combat. It ground-looped viciously on landing. Torque rolled on takeoff. It dove so aggressively that pilots discovered compressibility firsthand. Controls freezing as shock waves form on the wings at high speed. Many pilots hated it. But those who mastered it discovered something extraordinary. Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson, a farm boy from Oklahoma who would later score 27 aerial victories, described his first flight. It was like strapping yourself to a locomotive. You didn't fly it, you aimed it. The first combat encounters in April and May 1943 confirmed every German prejudice. The P-47 could not turn with the FW-190. It could not climb with the Bf-109. It felt sluggish and unresponsive at medium altitudes. Luftwaffe pilots exploited these weaknesses mercilessly, attacking from below, forcing turning engagements, dragging Thunderbolts into fights where agility mattered more than power. After his first encounter, Joseph Pips Priller, commander JG-26, reported confidently, "The new American fighter is meat for the slaughter. It flies like a truck, turns like a freight train, and climbs like a pregnant cow." The statistics seem to agree. In their first month of operations, American units lost 14 Thunderbolts for only 3 confirmed German kills. Even the RAF quietly suggested the Americans reconsider their choice of aircraft. British pilots joked that the best evasive maneuver in AP-47 was to unstrap and run around the cockpit. But something strange was happening. Something German intelligence failed to notice. The Thunderbolts that fell did not fall easily. One aircraft returned from a May 4th mission with 21 cannon holes and over 100 machine gun strikes. Damage that would have shredded a Spitfire or Messerschmitt. The massive radial engine, lacking vulnerable coolant systems, kept running after hits that would have killed liquid-cooled fighters instantly. And when the P-47s did get their guns on target, the results were catastrophic. Unlike German cannon with limited ammunition, the Thunderbolt could maintain sustained fire for over 30 seconds, an eternity in air combat. When all 8 guns converged, the sky itself seemed to tear apart. The Germans laughed in April. They would not be laughing for long. By early summer 1943, the Luftwaffe was convinced it had solved the American problem. The P-47 Thunderbolt, they believed, was a failure. Too heavy, too slow to climb, too clumsy to fight properly. German pilots had faced Spitfires and Hurricanes at the height of Britain's desperation, had survived the frozen hell of the Eastern Front, and had mastered the vertical energy fighting that defined modern aerial combat. Against such experience, the big American fighter looked laughably outmatched. Yet beneath the kill tallies and conflict reports, something unsettling was emerging. The Thunderbolts refused to die. Pilots who returned from combat brought back aircraft riddled with holes, engines leaking oil, control surfaces torn and shredded, yet still flying. German gunners reported solid hits, even explosive impacts, followed by disbelief as the enemy aircraft simply continued on its way. At first, these reports were dismissed as exaggeration. Then came June 26, 1943. Second Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson, fly with the 61st Fighter Squadron, was returning from escort duty over France as part of a formation of 48 P-47s. The mission had been uneventful until 16 Focke-Wulf FW-190s from JG-26 swept down from above, perfectly positioned, led by Wilhelm Ferdinand Galland, younger brother of the legendary Adolf Galland. The Germans executed the attack flawlessly. They dove out of the sun with overwhelming speed, cannon fire flashing as they cut into the American formation. Johnson, flying at the rear, was hit almost immediately. 20-millimeter shells exploded across his Thunderbolt. The canopy shattered. Hydraulic fluid sprayed into the cockpit. The engine cowling tore away, exposing the double wasp churning cylinders. Fire erupted behind the instrument panel. Johnson tried to bail out. The canopy would not move. A cannon shell had detonated in the canopy track, welding it shut. He was trapped at 27,000 feet in what should have been a falling corpse. Blinded by oil coating the windscreen, wounded in the nose and leg by shrapnel, Johnson somehow managed to level the aircraft. The controls barely responded. The engine shook violently, threatening to tear itself free. Yet the Thunderbolt kept flying. Johnson turned west toward England, coaxing what little life remained from the engine. He hoped that the Germans would assume him finished. They did not. A lone FW-190, flown by an unidentified pilot from 2/JG-26, spotted the crippled American limping toward the channel at barely 170 miles per hour. The German pilot closed in. From behind, he opened fire with his 20mm cannon and 13mm machine guns. Johnson could do nothing. He crouched behind his armor plate and waited for death. The Thunderbolt absorbed everything. Shells slammed into the fuselage. Bullets tore through wings and tail. The aircraft shuddered and shook, but it did not break apart. The German fired until his cannon ammunition was exhausted. Then he repositioned and fired again, this time using only his machine guns. Still, the P-47 flew. The German pilot pulled alongside. Johnson could see his face clearly, young blonde, eyes wide with disbelief. The pilot stared at the flying wreck beside him, its skin peeled back, smoke trailing from multiple wounds, yet still airborne. The German shook his head. He saluted. Then he broke away and disappeared, out of ammunition, out of answers. Johnson's Thunderbolt crossed the English coast barely, holding together. The engine finally failed as the aircraft touched down at Manston Airfield. Ground crews rushed to pull him from the cockpit. They stopped counting bullet holes after reaching 200. One cannon shell had detonated inches from Johnson's head. Another had exploded against the armor plate behind his seat. 3 of the 4 main fuselage longerons, the structural backbone of the aircraft, were shot through. Control cables were partially severed. The engine had taken multiple direct hits. Any other fighter would have disintegrated. The Thunderbolt had brought him home. The impact of Johnson's survival rippled outward. American engineers studying the wreckage realized they had underestimated their own creation. The Thunderbolt was not merely tough. It was extraordinarily overbuilt. Its structure absorbed punishment far beyond design expectations. German intelligence received combat reports describing an aircraft that simply refused to fall. Initially, they rejected the claims as fantasy. No single-engine fighter could absorb that much damage. But multiple pilots told the same story. The Americans had built something unnatural. By July 1943, lessons were finally sinking in. Colonel Hubert Zemke, commanding the 56th Fighter Group, reached a hard-earned conclusion through relentless experimentation. Do not fight German fighters on their terms. Instead, Zemke taught his pilots to exploit what the P-47 possessed in abundance: mass and power. Don't turn with them. Don't climb with them at low altitude. Use your weight. Use your speed. Use your guns. The Thunderbolt's weight, once a curse, became a weapon. In a dive, nothing could catch it. From 30,000 feet, a P-47 could exceed 550 miles per hour, faster than any German fighter could safely follow. Even in a vertical dive, Luftwaffe aircraft risked structural failure before matching its speed, and speed could be traded for altitude. Thunderbolt's dove fired and zoomed back upward, converting kinetic energy into height, while German fighters fell behind, gasping in thin air. This was not dogfighting. It was execution. Captain Walker, Bud, Mahurin refined the tactic into a lethal doctrine. American pilots called it boom and zoom. Germans would later call it something else entirely. The Thunderbolts would climb above 30,000 feet, where German fighters struggled. When enemy aircraft appeared below, the P-47s rolled inverted and dove in formation, building terrifying speed. Deflection shots became nearly impossible for defenders. At the bottom of the dive, the Thunderbolt's 8 Browning machine guns unleashed solid streams of fire. German pilots described it as flying into a wall. Aircraft caught in that convergence zone did not spiral downward or trail smoke. They simply came apart, wings torn free, fuselages shredded, tails severed. The laughter from April vanished. By August 1943, fear had replaced mockery. The transformation became unmistakable during the August 17th raids on Schweinfurt and Regensburg, the deepest daylight penetration into Germany yet attempted. Major David Schilling of the 62nd Fighter Squadron encountered formation of heavily armed Messerschmitt Bf 110 destroyers positioning to attack American bombers. Schilling's 4 Thunderbolts rolled into a diving attack from 28,000 feet. A German gunner later recalled, "The American fighters came down like hammers from heaven. I fired first. I saw my rounds hit the wing. The P-47 did not even wobble. Then he fired. The aircraft ahead of us simply ceased to exist. In less than a minute, multiple German aircraft were destroyed, obliterated by concentrated firepower unlike anything the Luftwaffe had faced. The Thunderbolt's true nature was finally revealed. It was not elegant. It was not subtle. It was inevitable, and the Germans were only beginning to understand what they were up against. By autumn 1943, the Luftwaffe was discovering a brutal truth. The P-47 Thunderbolt was not getting weaker with time. It was becoming more dangerous. What German pilots had initially dismissed as a crude, overweight experiment was now being flown by men who understood it. The Americans were no longer trying to fight like Europeans. They were fighting like engineers, with altitude, energy, and overwhelming firepower. And nowhere was this more apparent than above 25,000 feet. German fighters were reaching the limits of their design. The Focke-Wulf FW-190A series, superb at medium altitudes, lost responsiveness as air-thinned. Its BMW 801 radial engine, optimized for lower combat zones, gassed for oxygen above 25,000 feet. The Messerschmitt Bf 109, lighter and better climbing, performed slightly better, but even began to suffer as altitude increased. The Thunderbolt did not. Its turbo-supercharged Pratt & Whitney R-2800 maintained full rated power, where German engines faded. At 30,000 feet, the P-47 was still accelerating, still climbing, still fully alive. The balance of power shifted invisibly, but decisively. German pilots climbing to intercept bombers increasingly found themselves already below the escort fighters, a position no fighter pilot ever wanted to be in. Above them, the Thunderbolts waited. One of the first to experience this new reality was Oberstleutnant Hans Philipp, one of Germany's most successful fighter aces, credited with over 200 victories on both the Eastern and Western fronts. On October 8, 1943, Philipp led elements of Jageschwader 1 against a formation of B-17s flying at nearly 28,000 feet. The air was thin, the engine strained, and the German formation climbed sluggishly toward the bombers. Then the sky broke open. P-47s from a 56 fighter group dove from above 32,000 feet, converting altitude into speed no German aircraft could match. Their approach was almost silent, then sudden, violent, unstoppable. Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson, now a seasoned combat pilot, lined up Phillips' FW-190 during the dive. His gun camera recorded the engagement. Open fire at 300 yards. 30-degree deflection. Observed strikes along entire fuselage. Enemy aircraft exploded. There was no parachute. Hans Philipp was dead. The message to the Luftwaffe was unmistakable. Even its best pilots were no longer safe. German intelligence could no longer deny what was happening. A comprehensive evaluation of the Thunderbolt was ordered and delivered to Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring in November 1943. The findings were alarming. The P-47 service ceiling exceeded 42,000 feet, higher than any operational German fighter. Its dive speed approached compressibility limits. Its armor protection surpassed anything previously encountered in single-engine fighters. Most troubling of all was its resilience. Reports confirmed Thunderbolts returning with damage that should have destroyed 3 conventional fighters. The aircraft structure, armor, redundant systems, and radio engine created a survivability envelope German pilots could not overcome consistently. The Luftwaffe was facing an aircraft designed not for finesse, but for survival and destruction. As if altitude dominance were not enough, the Thunderbolt's greatest weapon lay in its wings. Each P-47 carried 8.50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, each with 425 rounds. That was 3,400 rounds total, nearly 900 pounds of ammunition. At a typical convergence setting of 300 yards, all 8 ballistic streams intersected in a space barely 6 feet wide. Anything inside that space encountered a storm of steel. At full fire rate, the Thunderbolt delivered over 100 projectiles per second, each traveling at nearly 2,900 feet per second. Armor-piercing incendiary rounds punched through aluminum skin, detonated inside fuel tanks, ignited internal structure, and tore aircraft apart from within. German pilots were accustomed to short, precise cannon bursts, lethal but limited. The American approach was different. They did not aim to wound. They aimed to erase. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Gabby Gabreski, who had finished the war as America's top ace in Europe with 28 victories, described the effect simply. When you hit them with all 8, they don't go down. They explode. Gun camera footage confirmed the accounts. Aircraft disintegrated midair, wings separating, tails shearing away, fuselages collapsing into flaming fragments. There was often no time for pilots to react, let alone bail out. The Luftwaffe had never faced such sustained firepower from a single-engine fighter, and it was about to get worse. In January 1944, a new Thunderbolt variant arrived in England, the P-47D-22, equipped with a Hamilton standard paddle blade propeller nearly 13 feet in diameter. The effect was immediate. Climb rate jumped from roughly 2,200 feet per minute to nearly 3,000 feet per minute at sea level. Acceleration improved dramatically. Energy could be regained faster after an attack. The flying milk bottle had learned to climb. German pilots noticed immediately. Heinz Nock, a veteran of over 200 combat missions, encountered the new variant in February 1944 and recorded his reaction in his diary. The fat American fighters have learned to climb. We bounced them expecting our usual advantage. They turned into us and climbed with us. Schmidt was caught and blown apart. These are not the same machines we laughed at last year. The sound changed, too. The paddle blade propeller's tips approached supersonic speed, producing a deep, rolling thunder audible for miles. German ground troops learned to identify the noise instinctively. They called it Donnerschlag, thunderclap. By March 1944, Thunderbolts equipped with external fuel tanks could escort bombers deep into Germany. 2 108-gallon wing tanks, or a 75-gallon belly tank, extended range beyond 1,000 miles. The Luftwaffe's final hope was to break through the escort and attack the bombers directly. That hope died quickly. To reach the bombers, German fighters had to fly through stacked layers of Thunderbolts. Fighters positioned from near ground level to above 30,000 feet, rotating cover and maintaining energy advantage. Major Gerhard Barkhorn, one of Germany's highest-scoring aces, survived such an encounter and later admitted, once the Thunderbolts were above you, the fight was already lost. The skies over Europe were no longer contested. They were controlled. As the Americans prepared for the invasion of France, Thunderbolt units began transitioning into a new role, one that would make them even more feared: ground attack. The same qualities that made the P-47 lethal in the air, armor, firepower, endurance, made it devastating against targets on the ground. Its machine guns shredded vehicles. Its bombs rivaled those of medium bombers. Rockets turned armored columns into burning wreckage. The Luftwaffe could not stop them. And on June 6, 1944, as Allied troops stormed the beaches of Normandy, more than 500 P-47s filled the sky. The umbrella was complete. For the Luftwaffe, the war in the air was already over. They just didn't know it yet. By the spring of 1944, the P-47 Thunderbolt had completed a transformation few aircraft in history would ever match. It was no longer just an escort fighter. It had become a weapon system. The shift began quietly. American planners understood something the Luftwaffe never fully accepted. Air superiority was not an end. It was a means. Once the skies were controlled, aircraft could be used not just to defend bombers, but to dismantle the enemy's ability to fight on the ground. The Thunderbolt was uniquely suited for this role. Its massive airframe could carry 2,500 pounds of bombs, rivaling early medium bombers. It could mount 10 5-inch HVR rockets, each capable of penetrating armor or collapsing bridges. Its 8.50 caliber machine guns, firing armor-piercing incendiary rounds, could slice through trucks, locomotives, fuel depots, and troop columns with terrifying ease. Most importantly, it could take punishment. Where lighter fighters disintegrated under ground fire, the P-47 absorbed it. American pilots quickly learned that the Thunderbolt was almost impossible to kill from the ground. Its radial engine, lacking a vulnerable liquid cooling system, could be riddled with holes and keep running. Fuel tanks were self-sealing. Control cables were duplicated. Armor plates surrounded the cockpit. Even the wings were massively overbuilt. Captain Walker Bud Mahurin returned from one mission with over 300 holes in his aircraft. Another pilot landed with half a wing missing. One Thunderbolt came back with a German 20mm shell lodged in the fuselage, unexploded. The aircraft was ugly, but it refused to die. That mattered more than elegance. In April 1944, Thunderbolt units began systematic attacks on German infrastructure across France, Belgium, and Western Germany. The mission was simple: paralyze movement. Rail lines were shredded. Trains were strafed until locomotives exploded. Bridges were dropped into rivers. Fuel trucks burned by the thousands. Horse-drawn wagons, still critical to German logistics, were obliterated from the air. German soldiers developed a new fear. They could hear the Thunderbolt before they saw it. The sound of the massive R-2800 engine diving at full throttle produced a rising roar that ended in a scream. Veterans learned that when that sound reached its peak, survival depended on luck alone. There was nowhere to hide. The Thunderbolt's attack profile was brutal and methodical. Pilots would climb altitude, roll inverted, and dive at near-terminal velocity, often exceeding 500 miles per hour. The aircraft became projectile, guided by a man and 8 machine guns. At low altitude, pilots leveled out, selected targets, and opened fire. Vehicles vanished in dust and flame. Infantry scattered helplessly. Flak crews were cut down before they could reload. Then the Thunderbolt climbed away, slowly, steadily, invulnerable, while ground fire bounced harmlessly off its armor. German troops gave it a name: Der Schwarztod, the Black Death. By May 1944, the Luftwaffe could no longer challenge Allied air operations in daylight. Fighter units were shattered. Fuel shortages grounded aircraft. Experienced pilots were dead. Replacements lasted weeks, sometimes days. That left German ground forces exposed. On June 6, 1944, the greatest amphibious invasion in history began. And above Normandy, the Thunderbolt reigned supreme. From dawn to dusk, P-47s flew continuous sorties over the invasion beaches and inland approaches. Their mission was no longer abstract. It was personal. They attacked German artillery firing on landing craft. They destroyed armor columns moving toward the beaches. They cut off reinforcements before they ever reached the front. One German panzer division reported that over 70% of its vehicle losses on D-Day were caused by air attack, primarily Thunderbolts. Pilots worked in pairs, one attacking while the other covered. They learned to spot the slightest movement: a glint of metal, a dust cloud, a disturbed hedgerow. If it moved, it died. Lieutenant Colin Kelly, flying near St. Lo, described his first ground attack mission. It wasn't like dogfighting. There was no duel. It was execution. The Thunderbolt's guns tore through German half-tracks as if they were paper. Rockets turned tanks into fireballs. Bombs collapsed entire road junctions, trapping enemy units in place to be destroyed by advancing Allied troops. American infantry learned to trust the sound overhead. When Thunderbolts appeared, morale surged. When they left, men prayed they would return. The Luftwaffe attempted desperate countermeasures. They deployed light flak in massive numbers. They camouflaged vehicles under trees. They moved only at night. Nothing worked. Thunderbolts attacked at dawn and dusk. They hunted shadows. They followed roads relentlessly. They destroyed anything that dared to move in daylight. General Erwin Rommel, inspecting defenses in France shortly before D-Day, noted grimly, "The enemy's air superiority has rendered all movement impossible." It was an admission of defeat. As Allied forces pushed inland, Thunderbolt units moved forward to rough airstrips carved out of French fields. Maintenance crews worked around the clock, patching holes, replacing engines, loading ammunition. Pilots flew 3, sometimes 4 missions per day. Losses were heavy, but survivability remained extraordinary. Pilots bailed out and returned. Aircraft were repaired. Units stayed operational. The Thunderbolt became not just a weapon, but a constant presence. German soldiers learned that the moment the sun rose, death might arrive screaming from the sky. By August 1944, the German army in Normandy was collapsing. At Falaise, trapped German forces attempted a breakout. Thunderbolts attacked without mercy. Roads were choked with destroyed vehicles. Entire divisions ceased to exist. One American pilot, surveying the devastation below, wrote, "I don't think war can get any uglier than this. But if it ends sooner because of it, then maybe it's worth it." The Thunderbolt had done its job. By the end of the summer, the P-47 had flown more than 500,000 combat sorties. It destroyed more enemy aircraft on the ground than in the air. It obliterated logistics, shattered morale, and erased Germany's ability to maneuver. It was not graceful. It was not subtle. It was unstoppable. Yet even as the war in Europe entered its final phase, the Thunderbolt still had one last role to play, one that would define its legacy beyond destruction. Survival, because the men who flew it, often battered, wounded, outnumbered, kept coming home. And in war, that matters more than victory counts. By the final months of 1944, the P-47 Thunderbolt had become something rare in the history of war. It was loved. Fighter pilots are not sentimental by nature. They trust what keeps them alive. And among the men of the U.S. Army Air Forces, no aircraft inspired more loyalty than the Thunderbolt. They did not call it beautiful. They called it home. The reputation was earned in blood, fire, and metal. Thunderbolt pilots came back with stories that bordered on the impossible. Aircraft landed missing cylinders, oil streaming across the canopy, control surfaces shredded. Wings were bent, engines knocked. Fuselages looked as if they had been clawed by giants. Yet they flew. One pilot returned from a strafing mission in Germany with nearly half his tail shot away. Another landed with his canopy shattered and his helmet embedded with flak fragments. One Thunderbolt made it home with a Bf-109 wing embedded in its fuselage, the result of a mid-air collision during a dive. Any other fighter would have disintegrated. The Thunderbolt absorbed the damage and kept going. Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson, whose earlier encounters had already become legend, provided the most famous example. In April 1943, his P-47 was attacked repeatedly by a German fighter firing at point-blank range. Cannon shells ripped through the cockpit. The engine was crippled. Instruments failed. Johnson was wounded in the face. Still, the aircraft refused to fall. The German pilot eventually broke off, convinced the American was already dead. Johnson flew the Thunderbolt home. When ground crews counted the damage, they found over 200 holes in the aircraft. The control system had been hit multiple times. The engine was barely functioning, yet it had carried its pilot safely across the channel. That story spread quickly, and it changed everything. Pilots began flying the Thunderbolt differently, not recklessly, but confidently. They pressed attacks lower. They stayed longer over targets. They fought their way out instead of disengaging early. They trusted the aircraft to bring them home. This psychological advantage mattered as much as performance numbers. A pilot who believes he can survive will fight harder, think clearer, and take decisive action under pressure. The Thunderbolt gave them that belief. By early 1945, Germany's defeat was inevitable. Thunderbolts continued flying ground attack missions into the heart of the Reich, escorting bombers, destroying rail yards, smashing airfields, and preventing any meaningful reorganization of German forces. The Luftwaffe barely existed. When German fighters did appear, they were often flown by poorly trained pilots with little fuel and no tactical coordination. Against experienced Thunderbolt units, the outcome was predictable. Still, the P-47 was never the fastest, the most agile, or the most elegant fighter in the sky. That was never the point. It was the one that finished the job. When the war in Europe ended in May 1945, the statistics were staggering. The P 47 had flown over 746,000 combat sorties. It destroyed thousands of aircraft, the majority on the ground. It eliminated tens of thousands of vehicles. It carried more bombs than any other U.S. fighter, and it brought home an extraordinary number of pilots. Its loss rate was among the lowest of any frontline fighter, an achievement unmatched given the intensity of its missions. The Thunderbolt did not fade quietly after the war. It continued serving in multiple air forces around the world. It flew in Korea. It became a training aircraft. It appeared in air shows, museums, and memorials. Pilots who flew it never forgot it. Many later transitioned to jets, sleeker, faster, more advanced machines, but they spoke of the Thunderbolt with a kind of reverence reserved for things that once stood between them and death. A veteran pilot summarized it best during a post-war interview. Other fighters made you feel like a knight. The Thunderbolt made you feel like you were wearing armor. That armor changed the nature of air combat. It proved that survivability mattered, that firepower mattered, that protecting pilots was not weakness, but strategy. Future aircraft designers paid attention. The Thunderbolt's influence lived on an aircraft that followed, machines built to hit hard, endure damage, and bring their crews back alive. The philosophy echoed decades later in the A-10 Thunderbolt II, deliberately named in its honor. Like its predecessor, it would be ugly, loud, and brutally effective, and, like the original, it would be loved by the men who flew it. History often remembers the elegant machines, the fastest, the sleekest, the ones that look best in photographs. The P-47 Thunderbolt was none of those things. It was big, it was loud, it was unforgiving to enemies, and it was merciful to those inside it. In the end, the Thunderbolt did not win the war alone, but it made victory possible. By clearing the skies, by crushing movement, by protecting bombers, by saving lives. It was not designed to be admired. It was designed to survive and to ensure that its pilots did the same. That is why, long after the guns fell silent, the men who flew it remembered it not as a machine, but as a guardian,